A thick silence reigned in the spacious two-story building, and this calm seemed unnaturally deep, as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation of some disaster. 3 loud gunshots instantly broke the silence. Their echoes swept through the corridors, reaching every nook and cranny, echoing in the windows with barely noticeable vibrations. Then we heard the shaking sobbing of a 15-year-old girl, a desperate sound full of horror and hopelessness. And there, in the middle of the devastated living room, stood police officer Kira Sullivan, clutching her service weapon and looking at her in disbelief, as if she didn't understand how she had pulled the trigger. There was complete chaos around. An overturned chair, a crumpled blanket on the floor, but the main tragedy was not in the scattered things, but in Kira's eyes, which were a mixture of despair, rage, and unbearable pain. She didn't say a word, just met the girl's eyes for a moment, who continued to cry, covering her mouth with her hands as if she was afraid that the world would crumble into pieces from her crying. And it was at that moment that it became clear that everything that had just happened would change their lives forever. Such a tragic and irreparable event had fallen on these walls and pierced them forever with bullet holes, pain, and despair. Kira Sullivan was a typical child of her city, Atlanta, Georgia, with its vivid contrasts, bustling streets, and contrast between old neighborhoods and modernist skyscrapers. However, despite all the color and diversity she grew up with, Kira felt lonely almost from childhood. She was 12 when her mother passed away. A complicated and prolonged illness took away the dearest person, and since then only her father, Mark West, has been around. At first glance, Mark seemed to be a caring father. He provided his daughter with a comfortable life, arranged small birthday parties for her, gave her expensive gifts, and surrounded her with attention. Even though Mark worked as a businessman and was often busy with meetings and negotiations, he seemed to be trying to compensate for his mother's absence. Especially in the first years after her death, he was really attentive. He picked her up from school, took an interest in her progress, and complimented her on her successes. It would seem that one could only dream of having such a father, but the atmosphere of the house, although wealthy, was cold and indescribable. There were hardly any mentions of her mother, and when Kira asked questions about her, her father would impatiently change the subject. Only later, as she grew older, did Kira begin to understand. Mark West was a complex, secretive, and sometimes aloof person. He tended to control everything without explaining his decisions. At the same time, he managed to maintain a reputation as a successful businessman whose office was located somewhere in the business center of Atlanta. Behind the scenes, he was called ultra-rational and a man without emotions. However, in Kira's presence, he still remained caring, although sometimes he showed signs of severity or even excessive categoricality, which frightened the girl. As soon as Kira learned to live with the feeling of losing her mother, she began to look for something to put her energy into. In high school, she was interested in dancing, then in social activities, and even thought about going to law school. Eventually, when it came time to choose a career path, she decided to join the police. The dramatic history of the city she grew up in also played a role: crime, inequality, and difficult neighborhoods. Kira saw a lot of injustice and wanted to do something to make the world safer. At first, her father was skeptical about this choice. He said that it was not a promising career, and it was a dangerous profession, especially for a woman. However, when he noticed that Kira was determined, he agreed to finance her studies and then helped her buy a small house once she got a job. It seemed like he wanted to be helpful by giving her the opportunity to fulfill herself. While studying at the police academy, Kira was persistent and hard-working, and quickly gained a reputation as an excellent student. She passed the shooting tests, understood the psychological aspects of negotiations, and listened carefully to the advice of more experienced teachers. She was noticed by higher-ranking officers who predicted a successful career for her. After graduation, she was assigned to the department, where she worked for several years before our story. But in the end, her personal life also presented challenges. She met a man, an ordinary guy who ran a small business, married him, and gave birth to a daughter. However, the marriage did not work out. Her husband was unable to accept her work schedule. They didn't spend enough time together, had quarrels, and one day it all ended in divorce. This is how Kira became a single mother. That's when Mark's role grew. He helped her when she took night shifts and offered to look after the baby. No one could have imagined that in the future this fact would be catastrophic. After all, for 15-year-old Ava, her grandfather looked like a perfectly normal guardian. He made her sandwiches, watched comedies with her, and took her somewhere on weekends. Kira was happy that her daughter had a grandfather whom she seemed to adore, especially at an early age. However, as time went on, it soon became clear that something was wrong. It happened gradually. Kira's daughter began to avoid questions about meeting her grandfather, and as she grew older, she began to make excuses to avoid staying at his house. And then Kira, with her experience as a police officer, began to pay attention to small warning signs that she had previously attributed to adolescence or moodiness. After all, Ava seemed to be behaving strangely. She would twitch from sudden movements, become thoughtful after mentioning her grandfather. "What's going on?" Kira asked herself. Why is the child who used to enjoy spending time with her grandfather now avoiding him? She tried to ask leading questions. Maybe you had a quarrel? Did he say something, offend you? But Ava would just say that she was tired or didn't want to go anywhere. Sometimes when she said the word grandfather, she would look at me with a fear that Kira had never noticed before. In Kira's mind, this seemed absurd because she was used to trusting her father and could never imagine that he, who had survived her mother's death with her and had always supported her, could be involved in something terrible. But the police officer's inner instinct, developed over the years of service, whispered, "Pay attention. Maybe something really serious is going on." However, it seemed that she did not want to believe it. Several times she spoke to her father, cautiously, dropping hints that, "Ava doesn't seem to want to come here much lately. Have you two been fighting?" Mark replied that everything was fine, that she's growing up and has her own secrets. Teenagers are complicated. Kira forced herself to accept this explanation, convincing herself, yes, teenage crises, a girl is looking for herself, hormones, stress. However, the concern remained. Kira began to observe Ava more, tried to talk to her, asked if any accidents had happened, if anyone had offended her. But the child avoided the topic, became irritated, and withdrew into herself. And then a feeling of powerlessness would overwhelm Kira. How can I, a police officer, not find out the truth in my own family? One day, when Kira hastily asked Ava why she refused to stay overnight at her grandfather's house, she ran out of the room in tears, leaving her. "I just can't. Don't ask me." Kira's heart sank. This reaction was too strong to be just another teenage whim. And yet she had no idea of the true scale of what was happening. Meanwhile, Kira's police work had also become more stressful. Crime in the neighborhood she served increased, and nighttime calls became more frequent. She would come home exhausted, often miss family dinners, and sometimes just fall asleep, barely speaking to her daughter. Their bond weakened when they needed it most. But Ava was left with the fact that, as it would later turn out, she had been going through a living hell for several months, and possibly years. And Kira, although she was on the way to this discovery, still did not know what terrible truth would soon surface and destroy their lives. The weather in Atlanta was fickle. One week the heat was followed by sudden cool rains. Ava, who usually loved sunny walks, was now often at home, shutting herself off from everyone. Sometimes she would spend whole evenings with her friends online, listening to music or watching videos, but this did not bring her any real joy. Kira, trying to reconnect, suggested that they go to the movies together. But Ava refused, saying she was not in the mood and wanted to be alone. This angered Kira and frightened her at the same time. She remembered how much fun they had had in the evening a year ago, watching comedies or cooking together in the kitchen. "Mom, I'm fine. It's just, I have my own thoughts," Ava replied when Kira tried to ask her again about the reasons for her mood change. At the same time, the girl began to react squeamishly when it came to meeting her grandfather. "I can't. I'm busy. I have homework. I'd rather stay at home." She kept making excuses. Kira watched closely to see if Mark's behavior had changed. He seemed the same, only a little worried that Ava was pulling away from him. "Is she offended?" he asked Kira on the phone. "She hasn't been picking up the phone lately, and it's like she's running away from me." Kira replied that she didn't understand it either. But doubt was already brewing inside her. She began to analyze whether there could be any signals. Perhaps Ava had once complained about her grandfather's inappropriate words, or maybe he was too strict. But Kira did not recall any such stories. Gradually, a frightening thought began to grow in her mind. What if? But she tried to push it away, thinking it was too absurd. Mark has never shown any signs of violence. He is a successful, socially fulfilled businessman who lacks nothing. However, a cold truth seeped through the police officer's professional experience. Criminals, especially those who commit domestic violence, are often just that. Ideal for society and monsters in the shadows. One night, there was a shooting in the neighborhood, and Kira, who was on night patrol, spent a long time filling out reports and investigating the circumstances. But her superiors let her go a little early, at 2 a.m. "Get some rest," they told her. "You're too exhausted." As she walked through the deserted streets of Atlanta, she suddenly felt the urge to go pick up her daughter. Ava stayed with her grandfather because it was convenient when Kira had the night shift. Lately, however, the girl had been reluctant to do so, but she had to because there was no one else to look after her. Kira herself doubted whether she was doing the right thing, but circumstances forced her to. As she drove up to her father's house, she saw the light of the TV in the living room. The door was unlocked. Mark often did this because he believed the neighborhood was safe and he was a strong man, supposedly able to defend himself. Kira entered quietly, not wanting to wake anyone, but a feeling of unease clutched at her chest. "Dad?" she called out softly as she walked down the hall. There was no one in the living room where the TV was showing some late-night show. There was a blanket on the couch, as if it had just been thrown in a hurry. There was no one in the kitchen either. Then she heard strange muffled sounds coming from somewhere in the back of the house, from Mark's bedroom. The sound was like moans or the sound of a struggle, and Kira felt her heart beat faster. She kicked off her shoes to better sneak up on them and reached for her service pistol, which she always carried. Step by step, the sounds became more distinct, barely contained hoarse screams, as if someone was resisting, fighting. Kira froze at the door, where a faint strip of light was shining through. Her hand trembled on her gun as she jerked the latch open and pushed the door open. What she saw would forever be etched in her memory. Mark was standing over a frightened Ava, who was lying on the bed, bruised and torn. The girl looked at her mother with wide eyes full of tears and horror. Kira immediately understood everything. No explanation was needed. Despite the nightmares, criminal gangs, and difficult calls she had seen in her work, she had never expected this from her own father. Inhalation and exhalation filled her chest, exploding with adrenaline. She pulled out her gun and pointed it at Mark. "Back off!" she shouted, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Mark turned around sharply, catching Karina's eye. There was a tinge of madness in his eyes, or perhaps a desperate belief that he was still in control. He took a step toward Kira, perhaps to snatch the weapon, perhaps to justify himself. "Stop!" Kira shouted a second time, but he moved forward anyway. Determination and fear were intertwined in Kira's mind. 3 loud shots cut through the air, exploding in the space of this bedroom that had become a crash site. Mark staggered and fell to the floor. Ava jumped out of bed, clamping her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming out loud. Kira felt her ears buzzing from the gunshots in shock, and her fingers were still clutching her weapon. Everything happened so fast that it seemed like a dream or a horror movie. But this horror was real. There was her father, writhing from his wounds, and her daughter, who seemed about to lose consciousness from the experience. Kira's officer's mind told her to act, turn off her emotions, call an ambulance, and inform the dispatcher. However, instead of a clear realization, she was flooded with a barrage of pain. "It's my father." She realized that she had just killed a loved one, but at the same time, she may have saved her daughter's life. In her heart, she felt conflicting feelings. Rage at the tyrant who had betrayed the trust and love of her granddaughter, and deep despair that she had to take such a step. Ava sank to the floor next to her mother, wrapping her arms around her head, sobbing softly. Kira sat down next to her and put her arms around her daughter, and felt her tremble slightly. Nearby, Mark was dying on the floor. Kira could see that his breathing was becoming labored, and blood was seeping onto the carpet. In a second, she realized that the procedure required her to try to administer first aid. Because she was a police officer, she was obliged to. But how do you help a father who has just done something terrible to your daughter? The moral stupor lasted for a few seconds. Then Kira rushed to the phone, called an ambulance, gave her address, and explained the situation in fragmentary words. It was the beginning of a disaster for the whole family. An eerie silence reigned in the house, broken only by Ava's sobs and Kira's loud breathing, who was suffocating from emotional overload. As time passed, it seemed that the seconds were dragging on for an agonizingly long time, each one full of chaotic thoughts and fears. Kira's heart was pounding as if it was about to jump out of her chest. She held Ava close to her, repeating soothing phrases, but she was barely on the edge herself. Sirens sounded outside. Ambulances and police cars were arriving at the house. Neighbors, frightened by the gunshots, called 911 almost as soon as Kira herself managed to report. Atlanta at night, which has always had its own crime stories, had another dramatic event that night, but it was especially painful for everyone involved because it was a family tragedy. The medics who entered the house saw Kira in her police officer's uniform with her weapon lying on the floor next to her, and Mark lying in a pool of blood. Ava was sitting next to her mother, curled up in a ball. Paramedics immediately tried to help the wounded man, but Mark's condition was critical. The bullets hit his vital organs, and despite resuscitation, he died on the spot. For Kira, it was a terrible blow. Despite everything, she was not ready for this finality. The police who arrived afterwards were also in a state of shock. Kira's colleagues immediately recognized a familiar figure among the crowd. Officer Sullivan, normally poised and calm, now looked distraught, her eyes full of despair. She surrendered her service weapon on the spot without resistance and informed the officer on duty that a tragedy had occurred involving the abuse of her daughter. However, the procedure stipulated that she had to be read her rights, even if everyone understood that it was a critical situation. "Kira, we have to detain you," one of the officers who knew her well said quietly. Ava groaned in despair as the two cops approached her mother with standard procedure. "You have the right to remain silent." For Kira herself, every word of this procedure was heartbreaking, as if she suddenly found herself in the role of a criminal instead of her place. Although deep down she understood the need for such actions, it felt humiliating and painful. "I understand," Kira whispered, glancing at Ava. "Please take care of the child." An additional team of psychologists was called for Ava, because it was obvious that she had experienced a severe psychological trauma. The doctors examined her and confirmed the signs of physical injuries typical of violence. When Kira heard this, she lost all self-control. She started crying and stood silently while they handcuffed her. Her emotions were mixed: despair over her father's death and fierce anger at him for what he had done to her granddaughter. A crowd of neighbors had already gathered outside, woken up by the sound of sirens. They watched as the police officer was taken out of the house where she once lived with her parents. Some tried to approach, offering help, or at least to show support, but they were not allowed to get closer. Others stood in awe, knowing Kira to be a conscientious and balanced person who would never have started a shooting without good reason. "What happened there?" people whispered. "They say she shot her father. But why?" According to the procedure, Kira was taken to the police station, where she was to testify. In the meantime, the house was sealed and a team of forensic experts began to collect evidence. The prosecutor's office, having received the call in the middle of the night, had already figured out that the case would not be easy. A police officer who shot a close relative, and in the context of potential violence against a child. It could have turned into a huge media scandal. The news spread quickly, and by the next morning, local channels were reporting on the resonant tragedy. A police officer shot and killed her father. What happened in this family? Some suggested that he could have been a criminal. Others were outraged that there was another shooting, and even in the family of law enforcement officers. A wave of public outcry began, in which the true story was not yet known. During the interrogation at the police station, Kira was pale and exhausted, but she answered clearly. The investigator in charge of the case tried to keep a professional distance, although he was well aware of his colleague's condition. "Tell me everything that happened that night," he asked, in detail. Kira, choking back tears, started from the beginning. How she had finished her shift early, how she had come to pick up her daughter, how she had noticed the TV in the living room but hadn't found anyone, and about the strange sounds in the bedroom. Then she described the scene she saw and the moment of the shots. Her voice trembled as she talked about what her father was doing to Ava. The frankness of these details was frightening, but essential to understanding the point. "I didn't plan to shoot," she repeated. "I just wanted him to back off. But he moved towards me. I was in a state of," she wanted to say, "affect," but perhaps she used simpler words. "I was shocked and terrified. It was a moment when I only thought about my daughter's safety. He could have attacked me as well." Investigators checked Kira's testimony for reliability, conducted a ballistics examination, and found that the shots were fired at close range. Ava's medical examination also confirmed repeated traces of violence in recent months. This became a key element that changed the police's attitude towards Kira. After all, she was acting in conditions where she had to save the child. But, according to the law, an open criminal case of murder could not simply be closed. The prosecutor had the right to file charges. The use of weapons could have been excessive, especially given that 3 shots were fired. In this aspect, much depended on the investigation and the court's decision. Even if everyone understands Kira's motives, the legal system requires a procedure. Meanwhile, social services took over Ava. The girl was admitted to a psychologist and doctors who recorded her physical and emotional injuries. She barely spoke, avoided direct eye contact, and did not want to recall the events of that night. But the bits of information that I managed to get from her indicated that my grandfather had been systematically abusing me, and that it had been going on for months. "I wanted to tell my mom," Ava whispered at one of her first psychological sessions, "but I was afraid that my grandfather would hurt us both. He said no one would believe me because he was a respected person." Hearing this story cut to the heart. Ava grew up feeling that she could not escape from this nightmare, and she remained silent because she did not trust even her mother. It was a huge trauma for both of them. After the interrogation, Kira was released on her own recognizance because she cooperated with the investigation and had an unblemished reputation as an officer. However, she was suspended from duty for the duration of the investigation, temporarily taking away her weapon. While the prosecutor's office was deciding what charges to bring, Kira was in a strange state. She moved into a small rented apartment away from her own home, trying to calm down and organize her thoughts. Every hour was a challenge. The image of her murdered father came to mind, exacerbating her feelings of guilt and resentment toward him. At night, she woke up from nightmares. She dreamed that she was shooting again and again, or, on the contrary, that she had failed to save Ava. Tears would fill her eyes, and the feeling of hopelessness was depressing. She still did not know how to talk to her daughter about this tragedy. The police officer's career was in jeopardy. Rumors spread through the department. Some colleagues sympathized with Kira, realizing that she was saving the child, while others believed that she should have called for reinforcements, tried to neutralize the father in a different way without bringing it to a fatal outcome. The superiors remained neutral, waiting for the results of the investigation. The media also began to escalate the pressure. Journalists came to the door of the apartment trying to get sensational comments. The headlines read, "A policewoman shot her father. Domestic violence or lynching." Some reporters spun the topic of Kira's possible mental disorders, while others manipulated the story as if she were a cold-blooded killer. Social media networks exploded with discussions, where some justified Kira, while others wrote, "Let her go to jail, because now everyone who doesn't like something will shoot." But the worst thing for Kira was that Ava was going through an unprecedented trauma. The child, who had already been scarred by violence, now saw her mother kill her abuser and her own grandfather. Ava's condition required constant supervision by psychologists. She hardly spoke, sometimes crying silently, sitting in the corner of the room. Kira was allowed to meet with her on a limited basis, as investigators feared that this could affect the objectivity of her testimony, and so the child was even temporarily placed under the temporary care of Kira's sister, who lived in another district. This made Kira suffer even more. She was losing her emotional connection with her daughter at the very time when she most wanted to support and hug her. She wrote Ava a letter apologizing for not noticing her suffering for so long and for having to do the worst thing possible. Kira did not know whether this letter reached her daughter or whether she read it, but she hoped that somehow Ava would be able to find the strength to forgive. Several months passed while the prosecutor collected all the evidence. Finally, the day of the trial came to decide Kira's fate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. On the one hand, there was the police officer who shot and killed her father, and on the other hand, the proven facts of sexual abuse of a minor. Public opinion was divided. Many believed that Kira had acted correctly in protecting the child, while others criticized the excessive use of force. The prosecutor took a rather harsh stance. Yes, there was violence, but it is worth determining whether Kira had other options. Could she have tied her father up or called for reinforcements? Were the 3 clean kill shots really the only option? Why not one? Why not in the leg? Why not a warning shot? Kira's lawyer emphasized that she was in a state of affect when she saw her daughter in real danger in an instant. "She is not only an officer, but first and foremost a mother," the lawyer summarized. "Imagine that you find yourself in front of a scene of violence against your own child. Do you have time to choose how many shots to make and what part of the body to target in order to neutralize, not kill?" Medical witnesses testified in court, describing Ava's injuries and confirming that the rape was repeated, with threats and intimidation. Psychologists explained how teenage victims remain silent out of fear and shame. One of the forensic psychologists described in detail how deeply Kira herself could have been traumatized when she caught her father red-handed. Ava was also supposed to testify, but due to her mental state, the court allowed her to do so in a mild way, via video conference, not in front of a full courtroom. She cried when she talked about all the things that Grandpa did, and said she was relieved when Mom came and saved me. This had a significant impact on the jury, who saw how long and painfully the child had suffered. Eventually, after several days of hearings, the jury went to deliberations. Given all the facts, they had to decide whether Kira's actions constituted premeditated murder in cold blood or could be qualified as exceeding the limits of necessary defense. A few hours later, they returned with a verdict: guilty of exceeding the limits of necessary defense. This meant that she was still considered responsible for the death of a person, but at the same time, the motives and circumstances under which she did it were recognized. The judge took into account strong mitigating circumstances: the protection of the child from a real threat, Kira's emotional state, her impeccable service in the police, as well as Ava's own words, who actually owed her mother her life. In the end, the court sentenced her to 2 years in prison with the possibility of early release. For many, this seemed like a compromise. On the one hand, society could not legalize murder, even for such reasons, and on the other hand, it actually recognized Kira's heroic act. When the judge read out the verdict, the room fell silent. Some expected her to be fully acquitted. Others feared that she would be given a much longer sentence. Kira's lawyer looked at her, realizing that appeals were possible, but unlikely to change the situation much. Kira stood there as if emotionally switched off, because the last months had burned her soul to the ground. After the verdict, Kira Sullivan was sent to a correctional facility for a while, where she was to serve a 2-year sentence with the possibility of early release. It was a stunning turn in the life of a woman who until recently believed in her ability to protect law and order in her hometown. Now she had to sit behind bars, and every day she spent in prison was filled with memories of the terrible night she shot her own father. The correctional facility where Kira was placed was not particularly harsh. It was rather designed for people with extenuating circumstances. But it was still a prison regime, with routines, restrictions, cells, and inmates, among whom Kira had to find a way to survive. Fortunately, her former police service earned her some respect among the other inmates, particularly those who respected officers when they had no personal grudge. But some were hostile, some with distrust, some simply out of principle. Imprisonment also took a toll on her mental state. She felt that, despite her formal guilt, she did not regret her actions. She had saved her daughter. However, the feeling of guilt towards herself that she had not protected Ava earlier, that she had not been more attentive to the alarm signals, was eating her up inside. In her letters to her sister and lawyer, Kira kept mentioning it. The worst thing is the idea that I could have stopped this violence back when Ava first avoided going to her grandfather. I didn't have time. I didn't want to believe that my father was capable of this. Meanwhile, Ava was undergoing a complex course of psychological rehabilitation. She was prescribed anti-stress medication, regular meetings with a school psychologist and specialists who work with children who have experienced sexual abuse. The girl thawed out a little bit, but it took time. She temporarily lived with her aunt, Kira's sister. Although it was difficult to talk, the specialists explained that sincerity and disclosure of painful details are an essential part of healing. I feel guilty that I didn't stop it sooner, Ava said more than once in a conversation with the psychologist. My mom always wanted the best for me. She could not think that her father. I was silent because I was afraid, and it all went on longer than necessary. Despite the enormous trauma, the girl gradually returned to a more or less normal life. She attended school, albeit with a delay in her studies. Not all of her peers knew what had happened to her, as the family decided not to publicly disclose the details. However, rumors circulated, and some classmates sympathized, while others simply discussed it behind their backs. For Ava, it was painful. She felt like a target for gossip. Nevertheless, she had the help of her aunt, who became a reliable support for her. And on weekends, when the rules allowed and depending on the child's condition, they both went to visit Kira in the correctional facility. These short visits with her mother meant a lot to Ava. Strangely enough, the thought that her mother had lost her freedom to save her gave her strength and pain at the same time. In the prison's visiting room, they sat across from each other at a plastic table, exchanging words full of love and remorse. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Kira said. "Mom, it's not your fault," Ava replied. "You did everything you could." These phrases were repeated almost every time, in different wording, but the essence remained. Both were trying to forgive themselves and each other. The tragedy that had happened would forever haunt them, but they wanted to find a way to move on with their lives. A year into her sentence, Kira was given a chance to be released early for good behavior and cooperation with the investigation. The special commission considered her case. Numerous letters from police colleagues testifying to Kira's high moral qualities, psychologist reports stating that she was not a danger to society, and a touching letter from Ava in which she asked, "I need my mom. I want her to come back." All this had a significant impact on the decision. When Kira was eventually released on parole, a little over a year and a half later, she left the penitentiary with mixed feelings. Freedom did not provide complete relief, as she had to adapt to a new life, a lost police career and a ruined reputation. She couldn't keep the house where the tragedy happened for moral reasons, so she decided to sell it. She needed to find a job and start over. At the same time, Ava was actively attending counseling sessions, gradually coming to her senses. She developed something similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes she had terrible dreams, but the support of her mother, now free, was the most important factor in overcoming the psychological consequences. The doctors recommended spending more time together in a safe environment, doing something together, even creative or sports, to help build trust and warmth. Kira made every effort to earn her daughter's forgiveness. She took her to the park and attended art therapy together, where they painted their emotions. Both were still suffering because Mark's shadow was hanging over their lives. Ava said more than once, "Mom, what would have happened if you had realized this earlier? We would not have allowed such a horror to happen." These words made Kira's heart hurt, but she kept saying, "I cannot turn back time. But I am here, and I will always protect you, no matter what happens." Some time passed, and public attention to the case faded. Other scandals, news, and criminal stories pushed it off the pages. However, for Kira and Ava, this tragedy remained a part of their lives forever. Sometimes Kira would wake up at night with the memory of the shots, feeling sweat on her forehead and her pulse racing. Sometimes Ava, looking at the photos of her beautiful childhood, realized that perhaps it had already begun. The conditions of her early release required Kira to report regularly to her probation officer, not to break the law, and to report any changes in her place of residence. She got a modest job as an assistant in a law firm, helping with paperwork, remotely using her experience in law. Some of her friends and former colleagues supported her, while others turned away, afraid to tarnish her reputation by working with a man who was serving a sentence for murder. Nevertheless, time healed the wounds slowly but surely. Ava began to do better in school, even revisiting the idea of going to college. She felt that she could be strong, and she saw from her mother's example that defending oneself is a right that must be exercised. Their relationship became even closer because they had gone through a difficult ordeal. Society has also learned a lesson from this story. The media started a discussion about the need to pay attention to alarming signals in the family, even if it seems impossible. There were discussions about whether the use of guns in families with children should be more strictly regulated, how to better protect victims of sexual violence, particularly in the family circle, and why sometimes the perfect people are the worst criminals. Although this did not bring comfort to Kira Sullivan and her daughter, their story became an impetus for reconsidering attitudes toward domestic violence and victim protection. After that, many people started to speak out. If such a horror could happen even in a cop's family, then no one is 100% protected. In the end, it all came down to the fact that Kira was freed from her label as a criminal, served her time, and now lived with Ava. They rarely mentioned Mark, however, trying to work through it with a psychologist and perhaps forgive themselves, and even him, for everything that had happened. Eventually, the realization came slowly, and it was that life goes on. And although the pain does not disappear, they are able to move on if they stay together. The world hasn't become easier or kinder, but Ava and her mother have learned to appreciate every day and to be more attentive to the silent signals that a loved one can give. Their story is an example of how horror can lurk in the closest circles, and that sometimes saving a child can be a painful price to pay with your own life. But when it comes to protecting those closest to you, perhaps no price seems too high. In the end, life went on for both Kira and Ava, with scarred souls, but with freedom from fear. As long as they stick together, they have a chance to build a new future free from the shadow of the past, even if it is with the memory of the 3 shots that have forever resounded in their hearts.